All right, guys, we've only got 30 minutes, so I want to go ahead and jump in, but do know this is being recorded. If you have to leave for any reason, we can get you that recording after. But I just want to welcome you. I'm Ashley Hyman. I'm the VP of Customer Success here at Drata. Again, we're so thankful for you joining us on our second installment of Ask an Auditor with our Troy Fine. We could call him our compliance influencer. We were super thrilled with all the feedback that we received from our first session, and we couldn't leave you waiting for more. So we're going to create a series based on this, and Troy's pretty excited to be part of it. I know that we had so much fun last time, so I'm expecting the same this time. Similar to our last session, we're going to try to answer as many questions as we possibly can, but if we don't get to your question, we will definitely either follow up with you or use it for the next session that we have. If you do have questions, just kind of a little housekeeping here, during the session, drop them in the Q&A chat. So please go ahead and use the chat for any technical issues, housekeeping, that type of thing. But if you have an actual question that you'd like Troy to answer, go ahead and put that into our Q&A. And we'll do our best, like I said, to get through them. I'm going to pass the mic to Troy. But again, thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks, Ashley. I think next time we're gonna do a customer success series for you, and I'll be asking you questions.
Oh, I cannot wait. Let's do it.
But for those of you that don't know me, I'm Troy Fine. Prior to joining Drata, I was an auditor for 10 years. I primarily focused on SOC2, but also did a lot with many of the other standards, regulations, and compliance frameworks. So happy to be here to kind of answer some of your questions, and hopefully they're not too difficult for me today. But so let's get started.
All right, let's do it. First question. I know you're nervous. Are you sweating? What are some of the most common controls that organizations receive exceptions on during a SOC2 Type 2 audit?
Yeah, I guess not a fun one to answer, right? But I think it's an important one to cover. I mean, primarily, when you're doing a SOC2 audit, a lot of the exceptions usually fall around the entity level controls. So think about like when you're onboarding employees, when you're offboarding employees, doing those background checks, doing security awareness training, doing access requests, removing access, all those types of things. Sometimes they get lost in all the chaos, especially when companies are growing fast. So even though they're not like logical security controls that happen all the time, those ones are very important and still get, like I said, kind of get lost in the mix. Another area would be probably vendor management. A lot of times they need to monitor the vendors, especially startups, cloud native companies. A lot of them are using a lot of vendors for their systems, and you have to monitor your vendors. So formalizing that process, documenting that process, doing it on a regular cadence. Sometimes people don't realize they have to do that. They just take a SOC report, say, here you go, auditor. But really, you have to kind of like really review that SOC report, understand user entity controls that you have to implement, understand if they had any exceptions, do they impact your environment? So there's a little bit more to vendor management than people tend to notice when they initially do it. And then lastly, I would say change management. As part of your changes, you got to have code reviews, you got to test, you got to approve changes. If you're making changes all the time, yes, some of that could get lost. Some of that change management process might not occur. So really focusing on those change management processes and making sure you have good controls around that would go a long way in avoiding those exceptions.
Awesome. Very helpful. I think everybody now has a checklist of things they're going to be sure they have complete. Also, though, no, Drata customers, we do a pre-audit check before your audit, where your customer success manager and someone on Troy's amazing compliance team will be there to also help to ensure that you're hitting all those key areas. So very helpful there. Another question that we got before the session started, we had some people emailing questions prior as, do I need to comply with the EU or UK general data protection regulation if I don't do business in Europe or in the UK?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I apologize if you hear my daughter crying in the background. She just went down for a nap. So sorry if there's background noise, but yes, I am human. But yeah, back to GDPR. So for GDPR, yeah, basically you don't need to have a physical presence in the EU or UK for it to apply to you. It's really any business that if you have any website where you accept visitors from the EU or the UK, when they visit your website, if you're collecting data on them, then you fall under GDPR regulations. You're going to have to follow it. You're going to have to make sure you get their consent. You're going to, especially if you're tracking their cookies, and pretty much every website in the entire world is tracking that information on their visitors. So that's one thing. The other misconception is that it only applies to EU and UK citizens, and actually it's really applying to residents, right? So if a American is traveling to EU or UK and they are now on the internet visiting a website, technically, because that IP address is originating from an EU connection, they fall under GDPR and you have to protect that information. And vice versa, if somebody in the EU is now traveling abroad, is in the US, and they're getting data collected on them and they're visiting a website, technically the GDPR won't apply to that person anymore. So it does only apply to people that are kind of located in those areas at the time of collection of the data. But yeah, so pretty much anybody on the internet with a website, unless you block every EU and UK IP address and don't let those visitors come to your website, then you'll probably need to comply with GDPR.
Wow, I didn't realize that. It definitely makes sense how many people we've had reach out after the launch of our GDPR framework, just because it is so applicable across the board. So very helpful information there. Obviously, if you guys have more questions about GDPR, do let us know. We can always help there. Another question that I think a lot of folks probably want to know, what are some common SOC2 misconceptions that you hear about most? I'm imagining you cringing when you hear some of these.
Well, I think a lot of people know the first one that I would probably talk about is that it's not a certification. SOC2 is an attestation, right? At the end of the day, a CPA firm is rendering an opinion on whether your controls are operating effectively and they're designed appropriately to meet the SOC2 trust services criteria. So that there's not a, you'll see a lot of people say we're SOC2 certified. It's not necessarily correct or wrong because it doesn't exist technically, right? It's not like a certification. It's not like ISO 27001 where you actually get a certificate and it says you've been certified and it has an expiration date, right? A SOC2 report technically doesn't have an expiration date, right? It's a report that an auditor issues for your controls that were occurring in the past, right? So that time period is always going to be covered, right? So no one can say between this date and this date, your controls didn't operate effectively. That's what the auditor issued a report and said that. So it's not like that report ever expires. But even though it doesn't expire, you still would need to probably get an annual SOC2 report done because your customers are going to want an update to make sure that your controls are still operating effectively, make sure they're still designed appropriately over that new audit period that you're having your audit performed over. So that's I think one of the biggest ones is certification. It's not a certification, it's an attestation. The next one is that there's defined controls. Technically speaking, SOC2 doesn't have hard requirements for controls. It defines high-level trust services criteria. Within each of the trust services criteria, you have to implement controls to meet those trust services criteria. Well, SOC2 standards, they don't define those types of controls. They provide you what they call points of focus, which are guidance, but you don't actually have to cover all those points of focus in your audit. And I think a lot of times when people, start using, start their SOC 2 journey, even start using a platform like Drata, they believe that, everything that's in there, you have to do 100%. That's what's required. When in actuality, it's kind of up to you to determine your controls. But platforms like Drata, like us, we're going to give you a good head start, right? You're going to have a lot of controls. They're mapped to the SOC 2 criteria, but we also provide advice on when maybe a control doesn't apply to you for whatever reason. Maybe your environment's a little different. You stored customer data a different way. You're not using this service or that service. So we can definitely provide that advice. But just remember that it's really up to you to determine the control. So if somebody tells you you have to do a control in SOC 2, there's always going to be room for, there's wiggle room there. It's not like some of the other standards. And I think the third one that we hear a lot is that you have to do a type 1 before a type 2. Obviously, we recommend doing a type 1, and I would always tell somebody to do a type 1 first. But according to the attestation standards, you can just jump in straight into a type 2 and do that more in-depth audit. So you don't necessarily have to do a type 1. Definitely a great idea, and you definitely should, but it's not required. So I say those are probably there's definitely more. We could probably have a whole webinar on that one, but those are probably the three common ones, we kind of hear the most.
That makes sense. Totally. I think those are ones we all hear on a daily basis. And even I think our CSMs on our first kickoff call start with common misconceptions that it's a certification, but it still gets said a lot. So a good reminder for sure. Let's see. Many of our listeners are curious about ISO 27001 and understanding what are the key differences between ISO 27001 and SOC 2? What are the similarities? Where's the overlap, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely another very common question that the world has, not just our customers. If you follow social media, you see those posts all the time. But I think that the main difference, if I were to start, would be kind of the idea of the information security management system. So in ISO 27001, the purpose of the certification is to ensure that you have an appropriate information security management system in place to manage risk, monitor risk, constantly improving your control environment. And it's really focused on this idea of managing your risk. And there's a lot of requirements for that. So there's a very heavy focus on governance in ISO 27001. Where in SOC 2, the concept of ISMS is kind of there, but it's loosely there, right? I mean, if you were just doing a SOC 2 audit and you were going through an audit, there are elements of risk management, risk assessment, vulnerability management, and vulnerability assessments. But the idea of formalizing that and having hard requirements where it's you have a risk treatment process in place where it identifies a risk owner and it identifies timelines for remediate. You don't technically need to have those in SOC 2, whereas in ISO 27001, it's very strict in that you have to have this management system in place, and you need to have appropriate risk treatment plans. You need to identify risk owners. You need to have identified SLAs for remediating risks. Now, when I do a SOC 2, I would always recommend people to do that. But when people ask the question, again, what's required, it's a little more loose for SOC 2. The second big difference is kind of the audience, I would say. So ISO 27001, because it's a certification, because it's a standard that was created by the ISO organization, it's European. So the focus is definitely on European customers. So if you're dealing with European customers, they tend to want to see that ISO 27001 certification. SOC 2, because it's an attestation standard created by the AICPA in the US, US organizations tend to want to see their vendors obtain a SOC 2 audit on an annual basis. So another, big difference is just the audience of who's requesting it and where it's kind of widely accepted. I think another significant difference is the requirement for internal audit. As part of ISO 27001, there's a clause, I think I'm going to say 9.2, but I could be wrong. I don't know it off the top of my head, but I believe it definitely requires an internal audit that needs to be done by somebody independent of your information security management system. So if your CISO is the one owning your ISMS, they can't be the one performing the internal audit. It has to be somebody outside of that group, outside of the ISMS, or if you don't have somebody that's independent and has the competency to perform that internal audit, you then might have to bring in a third party that has that competency to do the internal audit. All that has to be done before you start your ISO 27001 certification audit. And how that compares to SOC2 is SOC2, again, best practice. I would always recommend for somebody to have an internal audit and auditing your controls on a regular basis, but it's not required. It's not a hard requirement for SOC2. When you do your ISO 27001, one of the first things that they're going to ask for is, can I see your internal audit report? Can I see the findings that were identified? Can you show me you have risk treatment plans for these findings? Can you show me the corrective actions? All that fun stuff. And I think another difference is, this is my favorite question, Ashley, so I can keep going forever, but it is how the audit, I guess, works. So basically in ISO 27001, you have in your year one, you have this like stage 1 and stage 2 audit. Stage 1 is kind of like a readiness for your stage 2. It's a high level design of your ISMS. They're just going to check again for, can I see your risk assessment? Can I see your statement of applicability? Can I see your policies? Like, do you have the design of your ISMS appropriate? As part of that, they might identify areas of concern potentially for your stage 2 that you'll have to remediate. Once they're done with that stage 1, they then actually go to the stage 2 audit. The stage 2 audit is the deep dive actual audit for ISO 27001. And that's where they're going to test, really do a deep dive on all those clauses in ISO 27001 and test all your Annex A controls. So, they're going to want to see evidence for those controls, make sure they're operating effectively. Whereas in SOC2, there is no concept of kind of stage 1 and stage 2 officially. A lot of times auditors, I guess, will do like a pre-assessment that kind of acts like a stage 1, but it's not required like it is in ISO 27001. So, in SOC2, it's basically an auditor requests the evidence, they come in, they do the audit, and they tell you, they issue the report. But again, like I said, some of them do pre-assessments, kind of like a stage 1, but it's not required. Yeah, I could probably go on that one, but I think that's enough for that one.
Let's go to the next one. But all very helpful information. What would you say is the best way to determine your validation requirements for PCI DSS?
Yeah, not accept credit card data. No.
Just don't do it.
Yeah. So this one can be, it can be a bit confusing. I was confused actually at first when I started looking into it, but I think the first step to figure out your validation requirements is to understand if you're a merchant or a service provider according to PCI. Merchant is a lot easier to understand. It's just a business that accepts credit card transactions for services they're providing or goods they're selling. So if you are a merchant and you accept credit cards from the major payment brands, then you'll have to be PCI compliant. A service provider is a company that doesn't necessarily accept credit card transactions for payment of goods or services, but they can impact the security of the cardholder data environment of a merchant or of a payment brand, specifically. So service providers, for example, an example of a service provider could be a managed service provider, right? They're not necessarily accepting your credit cards, right, for you, but they might have access to the environment where you store credit card transactions, or they have access to the cardholder data environment where credit card data is stored. And because that managed service provider can access that environment, the merchant would have to make sure that that managed service provider is PCI compliant, right? Because they're a vendor, they can impact their cardholder data environment. If there's a breach at the managed service provider, then they might get into the credit card data stored by the merchant, right? So that's kind of the idea of a service provider. If you are a merchant, the first place you're going to want to look is to the payment brands, right? So the payment brands actually decide what the validation requirements are. So for example, if you're a merchant and you're accepting over 6 million Visa transactions a year, then you're going to be considered a level 1 merchant for Visa. Now, if you go to Visa's website, they're going to say, okay, if you're a level 1 merchant and you accept 6 million transactions a year, here are your validation requirements. If you accept less than 6 million, here are your validation requirements, right? As part of those level 1 requirements, if you are accepting over 6 million, you might need to engage a PCI qualified security assessor to perform an audit. So, in summary, for a merchant, the first place you want to go to is the payment brands, because they decide what your validation requirements are. Visa might have different requirements than MasterCard. MasterCard might have different requirements than American Express. So that's the first place you want to go. In the service provider example that I kind of gave, the payment brands aren't going to decide that. Your customers are going to decide what your validation requirements are. So in that MSP example, if the merchant decides that, hey, this MSP is high risk, we want to make sure they really are truly PCI compliant, they're going to put in a contract that you need to engage a qualified security assessor to perform a PCI audit. However, they could also say, we just need you to fill out a self-assessment questionnaire and send that to us. So for service providers, it's not as clear cut. You really have to look at the contract language that you have with your customers. But so it could vary for service providers. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing, but the idea is that merchants go to your payment brand websites to find out your validation requirements, and service providers talk to your customers and see what they require from a PCI compliance perspective. Did you get all that, Ashley?
I'm ready for PCI. I'm ready for my audit right now. Great detail. I think we'll definitely share the recording so people can go back and review, because I think that could be a challenging one to grasp all the detail on. I think we have time for a couple more questions. This is a good one. I think we hear this often, especially now that Drata has so many different frameworks to offer. If a company doesn't have any compliance frameworks that they've pursued in the past and they're starting fresh, like, where would you tell them to start?
Where would I tell them to start if they have never done compliance before?
Yeah, would it be SOC2? Would it be GDPR, ISO?
Yeah, I guess the first place I would say, what are your customers requiring as a first step? Ultimately, they're going to drive the compliance initiatives that you need to do. So kind of going back to that SOC2 and ISO question, if you're working with a lot of US customers, more so than international customers and EU customers, you probably want to start with SOC2, because that's going to give you the most bang for your buck. Whereas if you know that you have a heavy presence in the EU, start with ISO 27001. Now with GDPR though, technically GDPR, it's a regulation, right? So the second you're collecting data, you technically have to comply with GDPR. So, I mean, get your legal counsel involved early, from that perspective, because privacy, even though like you don't have contracts with customers that say I need to be GDPR compliant, it's a law in the EU. So if you're collecting that data and you're not following the law, technically you're in breach of the law. And if something were to go wrong, yeah, it could be bad for your business. So, from a compliance perspective, SOC2, ISO, kind of based off what your customers, but from like a regulation perspective, GDPR, HIPAA, CCPA, all those other fun privacy regulations, you really should start doing those from day one, because you're kind of breaking the law if you're not doing them.
That makes sense. Yeah, bad example on my part, but definitely good clarification, because I think it could be something that a lot of people would say, where the legal side, of course, like that's a requirement. You don't get to pick and choose there. Where
and I think I think one thing to know with that is, like even like for HIPAA, for example, a lot of times if you're a business associate, your customer is going to make you sign a business associate agreement that's going to say, all right, you're agreeing to comply with HIPAA, right? We're giving you protected health information. So sign this business associate agreement and sign off that you're going to protect the data and follow the HIPAA regulation. But the scary part is that that's a requirement for your customer. They get in trouble if they don't give you that requirement. That doesn't mean that you don't have to follow HIPAA, even if they don't give you that contract, right? So some customers might be getting that data. Maybe they didn't get a BAA from their customer because that customer wasn't aware or is not following the law themselves. But if there's a breach of PHI, you're still going to be held liable, even though you didn't sign a business associate agreement. So I think it's important to note that the law is the law, whether you're signing off on it or not with the data you're receiving. So it's really important if you're working with those types of entities or getting that type of data, that you really understand if you're getting that data, because if you're getting that data, you now have to follow HIPAA, whether you signed a contract or not saying that you would. And I think sometimes customers or sometimes organizations think if I didn't sign that I'm going to do it, that I don't have to do it, but you still have to.
Still a law. Okay. This will probably be our last question, unless you go really quick on this one, but we've had a lot of questions about pen testing. People are hearing kind of mixed reviews. Is it a nice to have? Is it a must have? Do you need it for SOC2 Type 1? Do you need it for SOC2 Type 2?
Oh, this is so yeah, I will always recommend to get a pen test for any, even regardless of compliance. I would always recommend to get a pen test just because it's obviously best practice for security to have an independent organization or independent person perform a penetration test, identify your gaps. Theoretically speaking, I guess in as terms of best practice from meeting SOC 2, in a type 1, there is there are audit firms out there where you can kind of, because it's only a design only, you can kind of have a statement of work with a pen test company. You can have a controlled design where you're going to have a pen test, right? Because what they say is in the type 2, you actually need to do a penetration test. And so if you're going to do a type 1 and then a type 2, some audit firms will say, wait till the type 2 audit period starts because we need the pen test to occur in the type 2 audit period. So for the type 1, they'll kind of accept that statement of work or that it's scheduled that to occur. So the design of that control is appropriate. I kind of stand in the camp of like doing a pen test as soon as possible. I would never recommend for somebody to wait just because they want to follow a compliance framework that says controls have to operate in this type 2 audit period. So I'm in the camp of always recommending do a pen test as soon as possible and get those gaps identified, because why would you want the bad guys to find that first, right? So always kind of do a pen test, but be aware that it's possible to kind of just have it scheduled for a type 1 and then actually do it for a type 2.
I think something you taught me in working with our audit partners that was important is asking those types of questions when you're getting to know your auditor, meeting with them. When is it okay if I go ahead and get my pen test, or do I need to wait until the audit period starts? Because I know we've heard mixed reviews there. Despite, I agree with you, it's better to get it done and determine any vulnerabilities rather than let those stand. But really great questions today. Wonderful answers, obviously, from Troy. So we're always appreciative of his feedback, knowledge, and influence, if you will. We really appreciate you guys joining us today. If you could take this 1-minute survey that you're going to see pop up for you immediately in your internet browser, we'd really appreciate it. Obviously, any feedback you can provide helps us to improve this session and future sessions like it. Obviously, feedback's number one thing for us. We will be sending out this recording in a follow-up email, so keep your eyes peeled there. I'm sure we'll be posting it online as well. If we didn't get to your questions, I so apologize. We definitely will next time, or you can definitely reach out to us directly. If you are a Drata customer and you're logged into Drata, remember you can also click the question mark in the upper right-hand corner and click Ask a Compliance Expert. You can chat with Troy there as well as the rest of our amazing compliance friends. They hate that I call them that. But we really appreciate you guys. Reach out to us anytime and we will see you next time.